All right, let's take you back to one of our leading stories now, and it is the coverage around the situation at Gold One Mine, and it's all about the recognition rights. Let's try and get an understanding of how this can be better handled in terms of the labor processes. Remember, two unions are at loggerheads here. AMCU saying that they want recognition rights because they have more support at the mine. The NUM, previously seen as the majority union, there's got to be a balloting process that needs to ensue. Let's speak now to labour expert Tony Healy, who speaks to us now via the virtual platform. Tony, good morning to you, and thank you for your time. Let me begin the conversation with this closed shop agreement that Gold One has with the NUM. What's the best way to handle that situation by mine management?
Well, good morning. First of all, these agreements called closed shop agreements are a concept that goes back over 100 years in terms of so-called Western democracies. And what they seek to do is, in certain circumstances where you have majority representation of a union, that majority union can, in terms of a two-thirds vote, enter into what's called a closed shop agreement, which essentially says that that's the only union that the employer will deal with, to the exclusion of other unions as far as collective bargaining and other rights are concerned.
Yeah.
They're considered to have value for employers to avoid union rivalry. Now, when it comes to a situation, to come to your point, if there is a closed shop agreement in place, then that means that the union with whom the employer has this closed shop agreement has exclusivity when it comes to, for example, collective bargaining. If you have, as we do here, another union which says, you know what, we're unhappy with that, we have a large number of members and we want collective bargaining rights as well,
yeah,
then in terms of legislation, they need to, as long as they've got a substantial and a significant number of members, they can apply to become members of that closed shop. And if there's a disagreement on that, then the Labour Court must decide if they should be granted access or not.
Yeah. Tony, I'm glad that we're focusing the attention on this, and you seem to know more about it. I've just spoken to the mine's representative, who made it abundantly clear that it is up to the NUM to voluntarily relinquish this closed shop agreement if they see fit. If not, then there is got to be a balloting process, which again, the logistics of it are left to the majority union, which is the NUM. That is obviously going to cause friction. Is it responsible for mine management to leave this process solely to the NUM?
Look, if I was advising on this, given the high tension that we've seen in that workplace, nothing prevents the parties and the employer, for that matter, in approaching the CCMA and asking them to facilitate the balloting process. I was personally involved in such an exercise a couple of weeks ago with clients where, again, you had competing unions, in fact, 3 unions, where tension is rising. You've got union rivalry, you've got claims of membership, you've got counterclaims of membership. The situation is tense, especially when the unions come from different ideological backgrounds and different federations.
Yeah.
There's really nothing preventing any of the parties, especially mine management and NUM in this particular case, from approaching the CCMA and asking them to maturely, responsibly, skillfully, as they're able to do, facilitate the balloting process in such a way that it minimizes the potential for that process to become derailed.
So, Tony, the reason, I suppose, we are pensive about the situation is because of the recent history we come from, and it involves the very same labor unions we're talking about here, the NUM and AMCU. Marikana, there is the example. And there was this fear last month when workers staged a sit-in underground, about 500 of them. Now, there were conflicting statements about whether this was a voluntary sit-in whereas others came out saying that they were actually held by fellow workers against their will. So, we have a history here, Tony. If something does happen, who must shoulder the blame? Who must take responsibility for any loss of life at the mine?
Well, look, I think all parties have a responsibility to protect the health and safety and security of everybody on the premises. That's every manager, every union member, and every union official. They all have a responsibility. And a factual investigation would have to take place ultimately if things went awry as they did about a month ago. A factual investigation, and I believe it has, will have to take place to determine what evidence is available to be able to lay blame where blame ought to be apportioned. That's a process involving an investigation. But at the end of the day, it's not unique, by the way, to these unions. I do understand the legacy and the history between these two unions. This kind of union rivalry happens every day across the country, not necessarily just with these two trade unions. Of course, given their history and given the magnitude of the issues that have arisen in this particular case, it is eye-catching and it is worrisome. And it does require the intervention, I believe, of skilled mediators and conciliators from, for example, the CCMA. But back to your question, everybody has a responsibility to ensure health and safety on the mine.
Yeah. Final question, Tony. And I know you have said that it is the responsibility of every party, including workers themselves, to be held accountable should any worker lose their life or be injured, by the way. But the problem is that we come again from that history of Marikana where not many people have actually been found guilty. There are not many people that we can point to and say they're sitting in jail today because of the atrocities that happened in Marikana. And so the lack of accountability here, Tony, is I suppose what is worrying. Authorities, what becomes their responsibility? Because they come in almost at the end of the process. The police, when they eventually got to that mine at first, they couldn't go underground because they didn't know what the conditions were, what they were going to meet down there. Eventually, we are told that some emergency workers did manage to go down, but they themselves were held up. The problem here is who gets sent to jail for acting unlawfully.
Well, again, that would be a criminal matter when you start asking about jail. That's when successful criminal prosecutions have been arrived at, and that falls squarely within the ambit of the SAPS and related agencies. Look, this is a very peculiar, unusual set of circumstances. It's not every day that we see these kinds of disputes taking place a kilometre underground, with so-called or allegations of hostage taking and the like. It is an extraordinary set and an unprecedented set of circumstances. When it comes to criminality, it's the police that have to get involved and with the prosecuting authorities to decide whether there's sufficient evidence or not. From a conduct point of view, it's the employer that needs to get involved to establish whether there's sufficient proof of misconduct in the course of all of these interactions, bearing in mind that the burden of proof when it comes to disciplinary misconduct cases is far less than the burden of proof in criminal cases. And I think I'm hearing that there already is disciplinary action underway against certain individuals. I speak under the correction at the mine. But depending on whether we're dealing with misconduct, it's the employer's responsibility to deal with that. When we're dealing with criminality, it's the SAPS and the prosecuting authority that needs to deal with that in these very difficult circumstances.
Tony Healy, thank you very much for clearing these issues for us. Labour expert talking to us about the situation at Gold One mine, the incidents that occurred there. You'll recall last month, 500 workers allegedly staging a sit-in. Was it voluntary? Was it not? Well, you would have heard the conflicting stories that came out of that.